Now, let's just kick off. This week, the Conservatives have whittled down their leadership candidates to just two, and in seemingly shocking news, it is Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch, both perceived to be of the right of the party. And I have to say, here in the office, there was some gentle betting on who would make the final two, and I have to reveal that no one predicted this.
No one got it right.
Will Labour be celebrating?
Labour were celebrating at Westminster yesterday. Ministers and MPs who haven't had that much to be cheerful about recently were in good spirits. A number 10 aide said to me, the candidate we feared was the one who would say, "We're sorry, we messed up, never again." Of all of the three candidates, Cleverly was the one who came closest to that rhetorical position. But there are some more sceptical heads in Labour who also see how Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick creates some risks as well as opportunities. Keir Starmer has been very aware of the threat from the populist right, and both of those candidates will try to exploit that.
Rachel, was this an absolutely monumental, I'm going to use a technical term, cock-up from Camp Cleverly?
So lots of rumours swirling around. Camp Cleverly very, very strongly deny that they asked supporters to lend votes. This is a thing that is a feature of Tory leadership contests, where if your candidate is in the lead, then you might lend a few votes to try and knock out the candidate that you most fear. And there were always accusations of this. Camp Cleverly said they didn't do this. Mm-hmm. There are reports, rumours that a number of MPs who were supportive of Cleverly independently looked at Tuesday's vote where he was in the lead by a substantial amount and thought, yeah, why not? And they kind of freelanced it. But they seem to have freelanced it in both directions, some trying to knock out Robert Jenrick and some trying to knock out Kemi Badenoch, with the result that Cleverly is out. It is a bit of a mess, I should say, and it leaves the one nation stroke softer right stroke centrist faction of the party, however you want to define that, without a candidate going to the final two. Now, it's worth saying that conventional wisdom suggests that when there are two candidates in the membership runoff, the members usually choose the more right-wing one anyway. So if Cleverly was in the final two, he was going to face an uphill struggle in that regard. So no one is suggesting that he was sort of certain to win, but he was making progress with the members, and it is a bit of a shock that they won't even have the option to vote for a candidate in that kind of sphere.
I should probably say, though, as a left-leaning publication, there will be cries from those, to the right of the New Statesman who say, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? And actually, anecdotally at least, sort of vox pops going on yesterday of Tory members were delighted. And they said, well, thank heavens it isn't Cleverly, so maybe we should.
Some Tory members are delighted. Some Tory members are despairing. I won't read you out some of my WhatsApps because they're full of expletives, but some Tory members are very, very unhappy about this.
One Tory member who is unhappy is our own columnist David Gauke, who rejoined the Conservative Party and then yesterday tweeted, well, that was a waste of £39.
He's not having a good leadership contest, is he? Because he initially thought Priti Patel had a really good chance, and obviously she got voted out first. So, poor David Gauke.
He did tip Liz Truss from the start.
He did, yes.
George, you've mentioned it already. I guess the Conservative leadership contest in some way was a welcome distraction for Labour from what's been a pretty tricky week. What can we, almost cheesy crime thriller titles, the Sue Gray misadventure, the McSweeney incident, of course referring to the ousting of Sue Gray as Downing Street Chief of Staff and the replacement of her by Morgan McSweeney. Take us back to the basics, George. What is the Chief of Staff meant to do? What is their role?
Chief of Staff is the Prime Minister's most senior aide, and their job is to lead the staff, to motivate them, to provide them with direction, and to control access to the Prime Minister and other senior staff. Sometimes it's a figure with a civil service or diplomatic background, Sue Gray, Jonathan Powell for Tony Blair. Sometimes it's one with a more political background as a SPAD or as an advisor, and that's Morgan McSweeney's background.
Rachel, did you see that Sue Gray, as a lifelong civil servant, one of those backgrounds that George says, was she a natural fit?
Well, it kind of comes back to what Labour wanted to start off doing as soon as they got into power, which was to reorganise Whitehall or get Whitehall working, knowing that they had a huge amount of work to do and none of the departments are kind of working properly. And it was seen as really valuable to have somebody right at the top who understood how the Whitehall machinery works, who the civil service trusted, because obviously the civil servants have had years of various Tory ministers and leaders blaming them for literally everything, who could understand this is the process, this is how you manage an organisation of tens of thousands of people in order to get results, and to not have the challenge that successive prime ministers of all parties actually have faced, which is you come in, you have a clear idea of what you want to do, and somehow in the Whitehall machinery it doesn't quite work out. And that was what Sue Gray was thought to be the star that would enable that to happen, because she has spent a lifetime in the civil service, she knows how it works, she knows the people. That was why it was seen as kind of such a coup for Keir Starmer when it was announced that she'd be leaving her role in the Cabinet Office to go work on his team. That said, it is an inherently political role, or it is a role that has politics kind of baked into it, because it's about moving the agenda of the government forward, but in the context of what they fought the election on, the manifesto, how they're perceived. It's not just a managing civil servants kind of role. And it seems like she was so focused on the latter part of it, or had such a lack of interest in the former part of it, that we had 100 days of people going, what is this Labour government really doing? And no single person there in Downing Street to be able to answer that question.
George, I mean, is that point that Rachel makes, that she perhaps wasn't political enough? We've read acres of column inches, is that a mixed metaphor, about the seeming disagreements or dislike between Sue Gray and Morgan McSweeney. Was that part of it, or has that been overstated? But is it that she wasn't political enough?
So I think it was a structural tension that Morgan McSweeney had been Keir Starmer's most senior aide. Then Sue Gray joins, and they report separately to him. And one of them is very political. The other one is a lifelong civil servant who comes at things with a different style. So I think that inevitably created tension. There were tensions in opposition. For instance, you'll remember Labour's agonised U-turn over the 28 billion pledge, which Morgan McSweeney saw as an electoral albatross. Sue Gray was blamed for delaying that decision because she was trying to, give shadow cabinet ministers then the chance to sort of defend their briefs. Ed Miliband didn't want to drop that pledge. Those tensions were then magnified in office, where in government, you're having to make decisions at lightning speed. And Downing Street clearly did lack political direction in those early days. One of the things Sue Gray is blamed for is the absence of a clear plan for the first 100 days. But the tensions went far beyond those with McSweeney. I wrote back in August that the media frame of Sue v Morgan was slightly misleading, because what Spads were saying to me was it's not Morgan v Sue, it's Sue v everyone. That was an allusion to
pay and contracts.
Yes, so she alienated a lot of special advisors early on by paying them less than they were in opposition, or less than their Tory predecessors, by giving them short-term contracts, and failed to build bridges. It's worth saying that she did have better relations with cabinet members who felt empowered by her, Metro mayors who had sometimes found Starmer's operation too distant, too remote, too uncommunicative. So I think one of the tasks of Morgan McSweeney will be to build bridges. He's seen as a more factional figure than Sue Gray, and he will have to show that he can be consensual as well as ruthlessly political, because Labour does need far more political direction clearly than it's had.
I mean, part of the calculus behind putting Sue Gray in that role in the first place was an acknowledgement that you need someone different from helping you win an election, which was obviously Morgan McSweeney's role, and one that he performed very, very successfully, to helping you govern the country. I mean, was that assumption wrong?
So I think the priorities for winning an election and the priorities for governing are different. And I think part of the tension may have been that up until now, what has Morgan McSweeney been doing? He has been working on Project 2029, how Labour are going to win the next election. And those are that is a different job to the day-to-day governing. But that said, you win an election if you're in power by looking back and showing, like, this is what we said we were going to do. Here's everything that we did. Here's how everything that we did fitted into the framework of what we promised we were going to do. We have a record now of 4 years of showing that we did what we said we were going to do. They're kind of quite linked. And I think a lot of the decisions that Labour has made on different areas of policy have felt quite scattered and quite disjointed, and it's difficult to say, okay, they've done this thing on the winter fuel allowance, they've done this thing on green energy, they're suggesting this thing on smoking in public. How does all of this fit into the kind of political operation that this Labour government is conducting? And you do need someone political to draw all of that together. You also need someone political to kind of keep an iron grip on that and bat away some of the distractions when there's a kind of news vacuum and the media sees on something, whether it's freebies or something else. And I think the lack of there being a comms grid, now there are different... Some people say Sue Gray was in charge of the comms grid. Some people
just break it down. Tell for people who might not know what is the comms grid.
We actually did a You Ask Us on what is the comms grid that we will link to in the show notes.
Okay.
But this is essentially what the government wants to be talking about every day. Different departments, scheduled announcements. Okay, this week is Crime Week. This week is Education Week. We've got this announcement coming out. The minister is going to be in this place announcing this policy. And you've got to spread all your announcements out so there's a bit of news every day, and so that you are in control of the narrative. And if you don't have that, if there are gaps, then the story will be taken over by something else, which is kind of what we saw with both winter fuel and the freebies row, which is that these sort of things came up and then there was a bit of a policy vacuum. There wasn't other stuff that Labour was really, really talking about very emphatically, which meant they ran and ran for weeks and weeks and weeks. And so there's a bit of disagreement as to whose job it was to do the comms grid for the first 100 days. But whoever's job it was, it clearly wasn't getting done in the way that it should have been.
Yeah, I mean, George, Andrew makes the point this week in the New Statesman, but there still isn't that role, that kind of Alistair Campbell role that will shut things down, will shut the message, promote the government's message, shut down the alternative messaging. I mean, is he right there?
Well, I think one of the other changes is designed to help address that issue, which is the appointment of James Lyons as head of strategic communications. He's a former Sunday Times, former Mirror journalist who subsequently worked as director of communications for the NHS, also worked the same role at TikTok. And that's an acknowledgement that the government has not always told a clear or appealing story about itself. As Rachel says, there was this vacuum over the summer, partly I think as a lot of people were on holiday and exhausted from the election. I think that's been part of the problem for Labour, is that obviously perhaps they originally assumed the election would come in the autumn. Then I think on the broader number 10, it's interesting that, as you say, Morgan McSweeney is not someone who has a huge amount of administrative experience, although he did the same role for Keir Starmer in opposition for a period as Chief of Staff, then moved to focus on campaigns. That's why the appointment of two Deputy Chief of Staff is eye-catching, Vidya Alex and Jill Cuthbertson. Now, there's an obvious potential division of Labour there, where they handle more of the administrative managerial side, and Morgan McSweeney gets to focus on what he's best at, which is campaigning.
I'm going to ask you to tell us about who Morgan McSweeney is in just a moment, George. But there's been some rumbling, hasn't there, that, certainly in Rosie Duffield's resignation, for example, that the Starmer administration is a bit of a boys' club. Do you see Sue Gray out, Morgan McSweeney in as evidence of that?
I don't. So I think the only reason that Sue Gray's name is as famous as it goes back to Boris Johnson and Partygate. I don't think this would be as much of a story if that hadn't happened and she had just been a very high-ranking civil servant who sort of moved across. So the fact that she is the most prominent woman, as it were, or she was the most prominent woman in Starmer's team that we've heard of, is due to a completely unrelated political story. There are really serious women in Starmer's team, both the ones that we talk about, like Rachel Reeves and Angela Rayner, who are pretty key to the Starmer government, but also in the back rooms, as it were. Like Jill Cuthbertson has worked with Starmer for years, like sort of managing access to him and managing his sort of image. Alexon was really key to the way that Labour wanted to reimagine its relationship with businesses and going out to get businesses to trust them. Holly Ridley is Labour General Secretary, who was their field director through all the by-elections and the council elections that kind of laid the groundwork to the election result in 2024. There are really key, important women. We just don't hear about them as much. Partly, I think, because Westminster likes to have one master of the dark arts behind the scene figure. Alistair Campbell, Dominic Cummings. Now we've got Morgan McSweeney sort of filling that character role. Maybe it's because they don't brief against each other as much. I don't know. Who knows? But if you do any reading into the people behind Starmer, there are some very serious women involved there.
Thank you. Very comprehensive. George, your profile of Morgan McSweeney is up right now on newstatesman.com. But for those who don't know, just who is he? Tell us a bit about him. What's his background?
So, born in Ireland, came to London in his late teens, worked initially as a building labourer, then studied at Middlesex University. First role at the Labour Party was a receptionist at HQ before the 2001 general election. So, a long history with the party, a real insider in that sense, but not from that sort of traditional advisor background of sort of Oxbridge PPE, which I think gives him a sort of rootedness. Really has made his name as an election campaigner and a winner. So he is really the person who, in the depths of opposition, designed a plan for Labour moderates to retake the party from the far left. Found Keir Starmer as the right leader for that. Could have been someone else, though. And people told him at the time that you can't possibly take Keir from opposition to government in a single term, and he did it obviously with one of the biggest landslides in Labour history. So there's someone for whom there's a lot of respect in Labour circles. He commands authority because of his track record of victories.
He had a good track record in London, didn't he, with Labour?
Yes, so I think one of the formative experiences for him was in Lambeth, where Labour had lost the council to the Tories and the Lib Dems. The council had a far left history, and together with Steve Reid, who's now Environment Secretary, who later introduced him, Starmer, they retook the council in 2006, I think through a sort of ruthless focus on voters' interests and distancing Labour from its far left past. He also worked in Barking and Dagenham, where the BNP were gaining a lot of ground, and they lost all their seats from the council. So John Cruddas, the former Labour MP who knows McSweeney well, said to me, he has an organiser's brain, but he also has real strategic interests and an awareness, I think, of both Labour's strengths but also its vulnerabilities. And you see this in the party's positioning on welfare and immigration. Morgan McSweeney is someone who's very aware that Labour MPs would love to scrap the 2-child limits on benefits, but it's popular with voters, so you need to do it in a careful way. So he is someone who will aim to neutralise those weaknesses while also amplifying Labour's strengths. Someone said to me that he's sometimes mischaracterised as someone who's just obsessed with winning. What really drives him is a sort of sense of moral purpose of putting politics on the side of working people. He is someone who's outraged by state failure as well as market failure.
Yes or no? Is he going to stabilise the ship?
I think he will help. I think he will give greater.
That's
direction.
not a yes or no answer, George.
Yes, he will. Number 10 is a more stable place, but as I wrote at the start of the week, Keir Starmer's headaches don't end here. There are a lot of problems.